Hey, what is up, everybody? Welcome to the Guilty as Charged podcast. My name is Steven, and I am your host today, doing a little solo video about some off-season rumors. Yes, the Chargers have been linked from Jeremy Fowler of ESPN to the Seattle Seahawks wide receiver DK Metcalf. So we did not get a chance to touch on this on yesterday's show. We kind of generally do not touch on rumors as much as we maybe would like to, given the nature of our content. But sometimes we really have to kind of focus in on the concrete aspect of things. So um, really make an exception here just because DK Metcalf is that kind of name. He is a monster of a wide receiver, and I think really on the field would make a lot of sense, which we'll get into in a second here. But I wanted to look at before I did this video, I wanted to look at what kind of trade costs are we looking at? What kind of contract talks are we looking at? Why would the Seahawks do this? Why would the Chargers do this? I think that last part is probably pretty obvious. But we'll get to all of it. And then I think we can kind of lay out a verdict of how likely or possible is this really for the Chargers to be linked to DK Metcalf, and what kind of conversations could this lead to going forward. Okay, as always, today's show and every show is brought to you by our friends over at Prize Picks, the best and easiest way to consume daily fantasy sports. It does really help support the show if you guys go over to prizepicks.com/guilty. The link is in the description, as always. Prizepicks.com/guilty, best and easiest way to consume daily fantasy sports. You only have so many more football games left. There's obviously only Championship Sunday and then the Super Bowl. So definitely hope you guys can get in on the action before the season officially ends. And we pivot towards the NBA and Major League Baseball and hockey and all of that other stuff that is happening going forward. So again, prizepicks.com/guilty. Link is in the description. All right. So again, the Chargers have been linked to Seattle Seahawks wide receiver DK Metcalf. This according to Jeremy Fowler, who every single year does a kind of a heat check, if you will, temperature check of where league execs kind of expect some off-season movement. And basically the executive that he interviewed, or one of the executives he interviewed, was saying that they expect the Chargers to be aggressive in supporting Justin Herbert, and that DK Metcalf would make a lot of sense for them. So let's dive into it. First and foremost, from a DK Metcalf standpoint, the production that the Chargers are potentially getting here, from this standpoint. So the ranking out of 69, I actually left on there from a previous slideshow that I made a copy of. So ignore that part. The rest of this is true. So this past season, he had 108 targets, 66 receptions, 992 yards, and 5 touchdowns. He averaged 15 yards per reception, 4.0 exactly yards after the catch per reception, 1.81 yards per route run, which was a career low for him. And he did have a contested catch rate of 36.6%. He had 3 100-yard games in the first 4 weeks, 0 after that. So I think when you look at DK Metcalf, there's more volatility to his game than I think might suggest. And there's a different kind of profile that his numbers suggest. He's billed as this big physical X receiver. That's not really the case based on the numbers. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend to be like the biggest DK Metcalf expert, but he has only gotten above 50% contested catch rate in 2 of his 6 NFL seasons. For the most part, he's kind of around a 40 to 45% contested catch rate. So it's not his strong suit to go up and get the football like it was a Mike Williams or a DeAndre Hopkins or a T. Higgins even. That's not his game. I think his game is the vertical route tree. It is the posts, the go balls, it is the in breakers, the digs, the daggers. You want him running horizontally and give him a runway as much as you can. He's not really somebody that you want to throw a lot of fade balls to. He's not really somebody that you're going to give a lot of contested catch ball situations to. And I think that has kind of bared out from the numbers. I think you essentially look at DK Metcalf as a burner who happens to be 6'4", 225 pounds. Is there more to his game than that? Yes, but his primary value is going to be stretching the field and hitting those vertical routes. And I think as long as you can kind of understand that aspect of things, we can kind of agree where we're at. So a lot of Chargers fans have kind of run to, oh, like he's a great contested catch guy. He'll be just like Mike Williams. That is not true. The numbers do not bear that out. Contested catch situations are not a strength of his. His 36.6% on contested catch percentage is actually barely slightly better than Quentin Johnson. So to kind of give you a comparison number there, that is the player you're getting. From a PFF standpoint, his overall grade this season was a 74.3. His receiving game grade was 75. PFF grades are very hit or miss for. Sorry, got like a little fuzz in my beard. His PFF grades do kind of hover in between the 75 to 80 marks. So I know grades are subjective, right? They're very hit or miss for some people. But he's never really been like a, elite grader, and I think some of that is just kind of the volatility I was speaking to, from a consistency standpoint, where one game he'll go for $120 and then 2 touchdowns, but the next week he'll give you 15, 17 yards. And if any of you have had him in fantasy football, you can kind of vouch for that as well. So the game-to-game production has not necessarily been there, and that certainly could be a result of the system of the quarterback play with Russell Wilson and Geno Smith. I will not tolerate Geno Smith slander. I think that man is fantastic. But maybe there is more to his game than being a vertical threat. We just haven't really seen it come to fruition in Seattle. He did just turn 27 in December, I believe. So very much in the prime of his career. Receivers are starting to taper off kind of around 31, 32. If you're a high-end route runner, you can kind of last longer into your 30s, and we obviously saw that with Keenan Allen. But theoretically, you should be able to get at least 4 seasons, at least 3 seasons, I should say, of high-end DK Metcalf athleticism. Now, he only eats candy, if you don't know. So that could be a factor here as well that we might have to adjust and potentially get Ben Herbert after that. He did miss 3 games this season with an MCL injury, but he has generally been a very healthy NFL player, which is pretty remarkable given the fact that he almost had to medically retire at Ole Miss because he broke his neck at Ole Miss, if you didn't know that. So this is a guy who remarkably has been able to stay very, very healthy. I think last season he missed a couple games. This season he missed 3, but he's, of course, knock on wood for him, but he's never really had any major injuries to this point, and he's almost always played close to a full season. So that's obviously a good sign for DK Metcalf. All right, why would the Seahawks trade him? I think this is important to analyze both sides here. The Seahawks are negative $27 million in cap space as it currently stands. That's with the rollover cap being accounted for from this past season. They have the 3rd lowest amount of cap space, of course, led by the New Orleans Saints, who are negative $52 million in the red. They continually just do not surprise. I love that fact that they are that low. But I was pretty surprised when I saw that the Seahawks were this far into the red. Some of that is obviously they're still weighing a little bit of dead cap from Russell Wilson, but they have a pretty expensive roster with Geno Smith, DK, Tyler Lockett, Leonard Williams, Draymond Jones, and Uchenna Nwosu all having significant cap hits in 2025. They can restructure some of those deals. We're talking about trading DK Metcalf. They could trade other people. They could cut other people to free up some cap space, but they have some work to do to get even cap compliant, let alone be able to go make some moves. So that is certainly part of the financial aspect of things is kind of the driving force of why players like this get traded. And DK would be their most valuable trade asset from that group. I think obviously Geno would have a ton of value, right? But, that's a very specific trade market. Maybe that doesn't necessarily net you a ton of a return, but Leonard Williams is kind of untradeable. Draymond Jones got kicked out to edge rusher this year for them. Uchenna Nwosu has been injured. Tyler Lockett is old and might retire. So the best trade piece you have on this roster is probably DK Metcalf. So for the Seahawks, you could potentially look at DK and say, we have Jackson Smith and Jigba. He had a monster season. I think it was, like almost 1,200 yards receiving. I think he was top 15 in yards per route run. Is he ready to be a wide receiver 1? If yes, then you feel probably a little bit better about, potentially trading DK Metcalf or Tyler Lockett. Doing both of those things is probably not great. Their wide receiver 4 from this past season was like Jake Bobo, who had 17 catches. So they have been very, very dependent on their big three receiver trio over the last couple of seasons. So even if JSN is ready for a wide receiver one jump, you still have to consider what does it look like to replace these guys that you are trading or cutting or retiring. And then the other aspect of things, their cap sheet is not great this year. It's much worse next year. And that's even before you take into account a potential DK Metcalf contract extension, a potential Geno Smith contract extension, etc. So right now for 2026, they're slated for around the same spot here of around negative $20 million in cap space. So there's a chance the Seahawks could look at this roster. It's not a roster that Mike Macdonald has really handpicked. This is a roster that Mike Macdonald is inheriting. And so maybe he looks at kind of around the NFC West, and, you have the Rams and you have the 49ers who are kind of aging teams. Maybe it might make sense for the Seahawks to say, let's take our lumps in 2025. And then in 2026, when the Rams and 49ers are much older, maybe we can be kind of that young upstart team, and maybe we can take that next step forward. And then in 2027, maybe we're the team in the NFC West. It's possible these coaches and GMs and everybody, their number one job is to keep their job, as Benjamin Solak always likes to say. So selling a rebuild to Mike Macdonald, I think would have been much easier last year. This upcoming season, his second year, it's very difficult for coaches to agree to that reset timeline when that's not what they signed up for. He signed up to coach this specific team and was sold the vision for this specific team. So blowing up the roster after 1 year, maybe it makes sense. Maybe it doesn't. Mike Macdonald, I think, would have to get a lot of assurances that if they blow it up and next year they go 4-13, that he would not get fired, right? Maybe they managed to win 6 games. Are you going to get fired after that? They might say, no, but we've seen other teams do exactly that. So again, selling a rebuild, it's easy for me, a non-Seahawks employee, to say that. The Seahawks employees are probably going to feel a certain way about, how to proceed with the future of this roster. All right, why it makes sense for the Chargers, again, on the field, very easy to sell, but from a financial standpoint, they have cap space to spare. $63 million in cap space. Currently, you are slated for 11 draft picks. Those draft picks are not official, by the way. Over the Cap, who does a wonderful job and generally does not miss on these kind of things, is projecting the Chargers to have 3 compensatory picks: a 5th rounder for Kenneth Murray, 6th rounder for Gerald Everett, and a 7th rounder for Michael Davis, which is bonkers to me. But that might change. That might be just the 2. Michael Davis might not hit, all of his qualifiers, etc. Maybe that is just the extra 2. So I feel pretty confident they'll get the 1 for Kenneth Murray and the 1 for Gerald Everett. But that other 1 for Michael Davis, I think, is very much in the air. So either way, potentially 11, at least 10. And I think that gives other teams around the league a window of where the Chargers could potentially go for. On the field, you obviously need a legit boundary receiver next to Ladd McConkey. And I think long-term here is key. If the Chargers are going to be aggressive and trade for a veteran wide receiver, they're going to have assurances that this is going to be a long-term potential building block kind of player. It's kind of why I have pushed back against like a reunion with Keenan Allen, or do they go get Tyreek Hill? The Chargers timeline with the roster, it needs to align with the players that they are going to get. So that roster alignment is something that Joe Ortiz has talked about. It's something that a lot of talking heads talk about. A 1-year rental for the Chargers in 2025 doesn't really make much sense to me. So if you are going to be aggressive on the trade market and give up valuable draft pick assets, you have to make sure this is a long-term thing, right? I think we need to keep that in mind, where a lot of fans are like, yeah, just do it for the 1 year. That's not where the Chargers are at, in my opinion. I don't think they would give up valuable draft picks for a 1-year rental. It's just not where they are at as a franchise. Joe Ortiz is so invested in the compensatory pick formula. He's so invested in doing this the right way through the draft, that being in year 2 and trading, we'll get to this in a second, but trading valuable top 50, top 100 draft picks for Joe Ortiz is not going to make sense unless you get this to be a 3-4 year deal And that's why kind of an older player like a Tyreek Hill, like a Devontae Adams, if he is needed to be traded for, that doesn't really make sense. I think they'd be looking for a long-term solution there. Again, on the field, Justin Herbert has a bazooka arm. Like, I think that's very easy to sell Chargers fans on DK Metcalf and just launching that thing, 2 or 3 times a game, and let's see what DK Metcalf can come down with. And then the biggest piece of why this makes sense for the Chargers is that DK Metcalf and Sanjay Lal are actually extremely close. And DK's best 3 seasons as a pro have been when Sanjay Lal has been his wide receiver coach. So that happened in 2020. And then Sanjay left to be the passing game coordinator in Jacksonville for Urban Meyer's Jaguars, which did not go well. And then he returned to Seattle for 2022 and the 2023 seasons. And when he returned, DK Metcalf spoke of him in such a glowing, positive manner that he said that they are like extremely close off the field, on the field. He's been very helpful in his development. DK Metcalf loves Sanjay Lal, and Sanjay Lal loves DK Metcalf. And there was a tweet from a Seattle Times reporter that when Sanjay was in Jacksonville, the two of them would still text and call and go over film and talk on a weekly basis. That's the kind of connection we are talking about here. And that matters, right? That if DK Metcalf goes to the Seahawks and says, I want to be traded, he's probably going to say, I want to go to the Chargers. I want to go reunite with my guy Sanjay. I want to go play with Justin Herbert. These are all selling points for DK Metcalf. Not that he has a ton of say in where he goes, but for the Chargers, there's a built-in relationship here. And as we've seen with free agents and trades, like inserted relationships or built-in relationships, I should say, really mitigate risk at a significantly higher rate than like we as fans would like to think. But it's the same kind of deal. If you leave your company, you would prefer to go to a company where the boss, some employees, like there's some comfortability, there's some familiarity there. And for DK Metcalf, if he's going to go into a brand new situation, he would at least know Sanjay and have a good relationship with Sanjay. He also apparently has a good relationship with Deion Henley, who posted about it today on his Instagram story. So these are all reasons why it makes sense for the Chargers. Potential acquisition costs. I think this is really where it might get a little dicey for fans and for the Chargers. So when I looked at this, I wanted to look at specifically offseason trades that featured a player in his late 20s who was on a second contract, who was a legitimately like top asset. Like teams were vying for this player, like multiple teams. So I'm not including like the Tyreek Hill trade here, obviously, because that was like 6 draft picks that the Miami Dolphins gave up. I'm not including, like the midseason trade of Calvin Ridley to the Jaguars, because that was like a really weird situation. So off-season trades, I think you can really pinpoint the Hollywood Brown trade to the Cardinals from the Ravens, which obviously Joe Ortiz partook in. Keep an eye on Hollywood Brown in the offseason, by the way. AJ Brown, Devontae Adams, and yes, Chase Claypool. If you look at these trades, so the Cardinals acquired Hollywood Brown plus a 3rd-round pick to the Ravens, who sent a 1st-round pick. Essentially, the Ravens sent like a high 2nd-round pick for Hollywood Brown. Or to the Cardinals sent a high 2nd-round pick. Excuse me. The Eagles acquired AJ Brown for a 1st and a 3rd-round pick. The Raiders acquired Devontae Adams for a 1st and a 2nd-round pick. And the Bears acquired Chase Claypool for a 2nd-round pick. At the time, Chase Claypool was at least like considered like a good trade asset. I don't know. But basically, you are looking at minimum, in my opinion, a 2nd-round pick and then some. Because DK Metcalf is this level of player, it's not going to be cheap for the Chargers to acquire him. And the Seahawks would have no reason to trade for him. Like I saw this graphic from the 33rd team where it was like, oh, the Seahawks get a 3rd-round pick. That's not enough. Some fans have said, oh, trade him for a 4th-round pick in Quentin Johnston. That's not enough. At minimum, in my opinion, it's going to cost you your 2025 2nd-round pick and probably more. There's a good chance that the Seattle Seahawks, if they traded him, would ask for a a huge price because we've already kind of talked about this. T. Higgins is potentially available, but if T. Higgins re-signs with the Cincinnati Bengals or he is franchise tagged, the next best wide receiver on the free agency market is Hollywood Brown or Darius Slayton or Keenan Allen. Like the free agent wide receiver market sucks. It is awful. So DK Metcalf, if he were made available for a trade, that's the best piece available in the offseason. And I think he would absolutely have a market. This would turn into a bidding war because he is that kind of player. And then also, this draft class doesn't sound like it's going to stack up in past draft classes where you could take a receiver at 55 and feel good about his chances of becoming a DK Metcalf. And so that's all going to drive the price up for DK Metcalf if this gets to that point. So it's going to be an expensive trade acquisition. I think there's a good chance it would cost a first round pick and maybe like a fourth round pick. But at minimum, you're looking at like 2 second-round picks, in my opinion. I am obviously not like plugged in like Adam Schefter or things like that. But based off of the trade history of relevant wide receiver trades and what this market of wide receivers is going to look like, I think DK Metcalf is going to cost way more than how he is being talked about right now. I think there's a good chance this is a first-round pick acquisition. And then I mentioned this, but you're not just trading for him. I think you also have to rework a contract extension for DK Metcalf the same way that the Seattle Seahawks are going to be doing. So at minimum, I think you are passing Brandon Ayuk's number of $30 million APY. DK Metcalf has a stronger history of 1,000 yard plus season production. He has a stronger history of making Pro Bowls and things like that. And if you just traded for him, he has more value to you than he does on the Seahawks, right? Because you are giving up that draft, you're giving up the draft assets to go get him. You're not going to trade him and then say, hey, here's $25 million. He's not going to take that offer. He knows that at that point, he has all of the leverage in the world. So I think your contract extension would be at least $31 million. Is DK Metcalf worth that? I don't know. That's where you get into these kind of conversations. Can the Chargers afford to pay a wide receiver $31 million? Probably. They would have to be creative in certain other areas. But, again, these are all things that have to be considered. So from a draft and a free agency standpoint, can the Chargers go into 2025 with their 10 or 11 draft picks, and then that becomes 8 or 9? And are you keeping your first round pick? Maybe. You're losing your second, maybe your third. Can this team in 2025 really afford to miss out on 2 top 100 draft picks? I happen to think no. I think they need those draft picks. Do the Chargers think that? Do they think they are a DK Metcalf away from contending? Would they rather have DK or on the contract extension, or would they rather have 3 or 4 other free agents and the 2 draft picks? And these are all things that Joe Ortiz is going to have to consider. He has an $18 million base salary for 2025. So the Chargers would inherit that. And then the contract extension would potentially drive down his actual cap hit for 2025. So there's a chance that his 2025 cap hit, which I think right now for the Seahawks, actually, I'm not going to think. I'm going to look this up real quick. Okay, so his actual cap hit for the Seahawks right now is $31.8 million. It's a significant cap hit. So for the Chargers, if they traded for him, it would be lower than that. I think it would probably be about $14 million, depending on how they structure the exact contract. So the cap hit would be more manageable for the Chargers than it would be for the Seahawks if they trade for him. And you guys know what I'm saying. And then from a depth standpoint, like I said, you're probably not getting a legit rookie wide receiver, draft pick in this situation. You're probably talking about like another 5th or a 6th round draft pick. So your main 3 would be firmly set as Ladd, DK, Quentin Johnston, some rookie wide receiver. Maybe that's a 5th or a 6th round draft pick. Darius Davis. I know fans love Brendan Rice, but essentially you are locking yourselves into Lad, DK, and QJ as your main three, and they're probably your main contributors. So again, I think that's definitely a very improved room from this past season. But again, are the Chargers more liable to go get two receivers instead of the one? Are they liable more to, is Darius Slayton plus, a second round rookie wide receiver, is that more impactful to the roster than trading for DK and then getting a day 3 draft pick? Like, again, these are all things that the team is going to have to consider. All right, the verdict for me, I don't think this passes the sniff test for me. I think the Seattle Seahawks will keep DK Metcalf, and I think they will cut or trade Tyler Lockett, not to the Chargers. I do not have any interest in acquiring Tyler Lockett. All due respect to him, he's a fantastic player. But at the deadline, Jeremy Fowler reported that teams called the Seahawks about DK Metcalf, but the conversations were a complete non-starter. Generally speaking, when a player gets traded outside of the Tyreek Hill trade, which was kind of out of nowhere, but generally speaking, there's like a buildup. Contract negotiations haven't gone great. He's frustrated about his role. The quarterback is frustrated with him. These things kind of build, particularly as a wide receiver. We haven't gotten that. And as of this past October, trade talks were a complete non-starter, according to ESPN's Jeremy Fowler. So that's one reason. That's one thing I think we definitely need to keep in mind. John Snyder, who's the Seahawks GM pictured here, does not have a strong history, really much of any history, of trading a star player unless that player becomes disgruntled. He generally, he's a build through the draft guy. And so he wants to keep his draft guys around for as long as possible and get as much value from those players as he can. That's kind of his general philosophy, which I think makes a lot of sense. So there isn't really a history, and he's been in Seattle for almost, a decade and a half. We know what he's about. So the Seahawks, I don't know how much that makes sense from a philosophical standpoint. And then the other thing here is they would save more money by restructuring him now or extending him. So technically speaking, his contract expires after 2025, but they put a void year into his contract. So 2026 is currently counting as a void year. So for the Seahawks, they could restructure his contract and save about $20 million in cap space right now and push that $20 million to 2026, essentially. They could also extend him. Again, you lower that cap hit from 31 to maybe 14 or 15 this year. And then next year, you kind of just keep that going and you keep DK Metcalf on the roster. So from a cap standpoint, they don't really save money from trading or cutting DK Metcalf. The reason why they trade DK Metcalf is really about the draft assets, more of the cap savings. So again, there's a chance here that the Seahawks do look at this and say, maybe we should blow this up. But from a cap standpoint, it makes way more sense for them to restructure or extend him than it does to get rid of him. And I think they have other easier players to get rid of that would save them money. The same reasons why you all and I would want him on the Chargers are the same reasons why the Seahawks would want him on the Seahawks. He's a great player. He fits perfectly with JSN, just like he would with Lad McConkey. JSN is essentially a less athletic version of Lad. I love JSN. He was my wide receiver 1 that year. But he plays in the slot. He does a lot of dirty work over the middle. He's a yards after catch guy. So you do need that vertical boundary player to complement him, as the Chargers are trying to do. And that's the same reason why the Seahawks, I think, would be wise to keep him. I think he is a long-term building block for them, even if they do some kind of reset. Even if Geno Smith is not your quarterback in 2026, I think he's going to be in 2025. So the Seahawks are going to want to, I think, keep him around. To me, this just doesn't really make sense from their standpoint, unless things go sour, unless he goes, they have contract extension talks and it does not go well and DK gets frustrated. It can always go south. But right now on January 22nd, I don't really buy this being a thing the Seahawks do. I buy the Chargers being interested. I think it makes a lot of sense why the Chargers would be interested, but I can't really see the Seahawks making this move right now. We have a few weeks until the combine, 6 weeks, I think it is. That's probably where contract talks for them will start heating back up. And I'm sure things could change. Things can always change in the NFL, right? Like we've seen that as Chargers fans. So I hope it happens. I would love for DK Metcalf to be on the Chargers, but it has to be right for all sides. These things generally, like it has to make sense for all of these teams. Like the Khalil Mack trade made sense for the Bears, it made sense for the Chargers, it made sense for Khalil Mack, it made sense for everything, right? It checked all these boxes. Trading for DK Metcalf makes sense for the Chargers on the field. Does it make sense for the Chargers on a cap sheet? I don't really know. Does it make sense for them from a draft standpoint? I kind of doubt it. Does it make sense for the Seahawks? I definitely doubt it. So it's fun. It's the offseason. I love talking about this stuff. I love getting into the weeds of looking at contracts and things like that. But I think DK stays in Seattle. I think he gets an extension. And I think the Chargers at wide receiver will be looking elsewhere. All right, you guys. Thanks so much for tuning in. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Alex Insdorf just dropped a video with Daniel Popper, so go check that out. We will be back tonight as you're watching this. I'm going to post this on Thursday morning. We will be back tonight for our next episode on J.K. Dobbins. So appreciate you guys so much for tuning in. That's going to do it for me. We'll see you next time. As always, bolt up.